We will start the presentation now. Could you please turn on the microphone, please? Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Is this working? Oh, great. Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for your patience. We do apologize because we're running late on this one, but I do understand it's a very important session for many of you, and I do see value in us, giving our very best. We do have a very interesting panel this evening. I'm going to introduce them in a moment, but just to start off, I am Michael Kimbi Tchenga. I am the DIT, that's Department for International Trade, Country Director for Cameroon. I'm based at the British High Commission in Yaoundé, and we do spend a lot of time supporting British businesses that are looking to invest in the country, but above all, those that are very heavily invested in the market. And not least of them, of course, companies that are interested in the energy sector. And we do have British companies that have very significant stakes in Africa's energy market. And the countries that are covered by this forum that's happening today have a good host of them. And some of the chief executives we have here this evening are from those geographies as well. So maybe just to set things first, as the world order returns post the pandemic, the African continent has shown tremendous resilience as economies look to bounce back across various markets and sectors. So Africa's energy sector plays a very crucial role, and that's something that we cannot overemphasize in driving, underpinning the recovery process. Now, the future growth in the continent, of course, would need to be powered, and that is what this session is essentially about, especially for the countries that are covered in the context of this forum. Now, there are about 700 million people across Africa who still do not have access to electricity, and this continuously undermines their ability to participate in economic growth, and development for the continent. But the good news we have this evening is the UK is home to some of the world-leading innovations, which Africa can actually tap into, both from a technological perspective, but even more so from a finance perspective. The UK capability is wide-ranging across the energy sector, from leading technologies in solar, tidal, marine, carbon capture and utilization, offshore wind, geothermal, bioenergy, biofuels, hydrogen, smart grids, and you name it all. Now, the Africa energy market stands to gain a great deal from the UK, and the current, based on the stats that we have, the current need in terms of investment in the sector stands at about 100 billion per year to be able to generate, many more opportunities within the African economies to get, more sustainable access to power. Now, the UK companies that are represented on this panel today have a combined installed generation capacity in Africa of over 1.5 gigawatts. So that's quite enormous. And some of these are in the markets that are represented in this inaugural forum. Without further ado, I'll just introduce the members of the panel. They will each have a turn to speak to the various areas of interest and the geographies that they represent here. The first person I would want to introduce this evening is Chris. Chris is the CEO of Lekela. Chris has extensive experience in developing power and infrastructure projects in Africa, having overseen initiatives valued at more than $4 billion, all combined. He has been CEO of Lekela since March 2015, and Chris is here this evening to share his very rich experience with us. The next person on the panel to be introduced is Loic. Loic Ehua is the business development manager for Gridworks. Loic joined Gridworks in 2020 and supports the development and execution of investments. So prior to this role, he was with GE Energy Financial Services, structuring and executing financial solutions for power and renewables in Europe, Africa, Latin America. And prior to his work, he worked at Albioma, a Paris-listed IPP where he focused on project finance and M&A transactions. And finally, with us this evening is Alex Douglas, who is Managing Director and Business Development Head for West Africa at Globeleq. Alex has more than 25 years experience in the energy sector, including successfully advising on and developing private power projects in Africa, Asia, the UK, and mainland Europe. He has a strong engineering and commercial background. He has worked in various roles for AES, Entergy, well, I see he's smiling, Linklaters and BP before joining Globeleq. And so you can tell from the outlook here this evening that it's quite an interesting panel with lots of experience, and we're going to take turns to talk about, the various areas of interest from which they work. Maybe I'll start off with Alex, having just introduced him. Globeleq is very present in Africa. We've heard quite a lot today, particularly from the perspective of one of the lead investor in Globeleq, that's the BII, the British Investment International. And it will be quite interesting to hear from you, Alex, what your perspective is with regards to Globeleq's work across the West and Central Africa region. And of course, you could also extend into Africa for the interest of our audience.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction. I was smiling because it was kind of like being on This Is Your Life or something. Thought I might learn something about myself. But anyway, yeah, I'll cut straight to the chase because it's getting late and I guess it's been a long day. Globeleq does have 1,500 megawatts operating in Africa, 722 megawatts in construction, and then a long pipeline. And when I look at those numbers, the 722 megawatts we have in construction and the whole 1,024 megawatts we have in West Africa, they're all gas. And the Globeleq of the future is going to be pretty much renewable only, which in West Africa is a problem. I'd kind of wanted to make this a discussion point, really, and just tackle it head on for us. Because the West Africa region, certainly that we're present in, is very long on gas. I'm very keen to use that gas, which, when you have a constraint, as an organization, being able to use the gas, it makes it pretty tough. So depends really on the jurisdiction, but there are technical and other resource challenges to doing those renewables, as well as the kind of maybe institutional and sovereign reluctance, because people want to monetize that gas, quite understandably. So for us, how are we looking at this, and what do we see the solution? There's one word really, I think, which is integration. So systems that have a strong grid, reliable baseload already, it's relatively easy to introduce those renewables and relatively easy for us to continue to provide additional megawatts. But when that's not the case, it's tough. The integration of those renewables into the system, or even developing the system using renewables, is difficult. One thing I just want to flag, we in Nigeria have a small business which is embedded or maybe franchised, moving towards the franchised end in terms of small generation. Relatively easy to do that in hybrid format, so gas and renewables together. That's one thing we're trying to do. And then equally looking at the more alternative end of things with hydrogen, carbon capture, and being able to do peaking plant like that. The other side of the integration that I just wanted to throw out there as a discussion point is regulation, really. So a lot of the markets we're trying to do this in, the regulatory regime is quite prohibitive, or at least not welcoming for smaller scale, direct customer access, and I'm sure Loic's got something to say on this as well, using the grid to reach customers versus having to actually build your own mini-grid. Those things are not always easy to do. Either of them are easy to do in many of the markets. And I think that's a key element to enabling renewables to kind of come in and also work alongside gas where that's allowed. That's my discussion points. Thanks.
Well, quite interesting there, drawing from Globeleq's major role in power generation across the geographies in the region. Maybe let me bring in Loic next, from a context where we know generally most of these markets are segmented, and you have the companies that focus on generation, and then you move on to the network transmission and distribution. I know Gridworks has been doing quite a lot across Africa, and I know there's quite some interest that has been developing in West and Central Africa, well, West Africa in particular. Would you want to speak to some of those latest developments and what the wider regional perspective for Gridworks is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. I think, yes, Gridworks, as the name says, we're looking at grids. So from our perspective, when we were set up by BII a couple of years ago, our perspective has always been that there needs to be capital to support the networks, because I think my colleague on the panel here represent that trend where there has been capital available for means of production. So whether base load and over time, we've had what we call independent power producers, but most of the time, that power that has been produced sometime cannot effectively reach the end users, be it industrial or residential customer, or sometimes because the infrastructure are either in need of upgrade or refurbishment, there are a lot of losses. So be it on transmission or on the distribution side. And there is the issue of access for more rural communities, and that's where some of the mini-grids came. So Gridworks has been set up as a response to that challenge, to be set up as a development and investment platform to look at how we can support countries where we operate in transmission, distribution, both what we call on and off grid, so we do also C&I. The perspective that we can give is that when we look at network and market based on their needs. We're doing a project at the moment where we're financing a $100 million project in Uganda to help upgrade some of the substation, the high voltage transmission infrastructure, and we hope to do so, to do the same in West Africa. I think our role here is probably more catalytic, so that when developers and when Chris and Alex are developing a power plant, they need to know if there is an evacuation solution, right? There's always a question, how do you finance it? Whether it's the IPP or the state, but in any case, that infrastructure needs to be there. But if you look at further down the chain, there's always the question around, okay, how do we connect those community? What's the cost of power? So West Africa is Francophone Africa, I think in a sense, is an important market, because when you look at, for example, Cote d'Ivoire and the name in the region, the network have a role of supporting, how do we call it, reliable power. I think that's something which is really important. It's when you have base load that you can also help renewable penetration. And with renewable, there are other questions in terms of network stabilities, and that's where the role of battery came. So from our perspective, we think that the next challenge to be addressed and the next bottleneck where we need to operate is on the network and on the grid. And in the Francophone region, there will be an important need, and we hope to help address some of those solutions.
Yeah, you've spoken quite a lot there to the importance of stepping up the efficiency in the grid, and I do know that power losses from the grid usually are some of the biggest challenges that operators get to face. Maybe we'll come to that in a moment, but maybe to turn on to Chris, who also has a lot of developer experience on the continent, it would be interesting because most countries, most economies, the ambition, the gap between ambition and what can be reasonably achieved is quite really wide, both for reasons of maybe the regulatory framework that maybe is not yet in the right place, but also with regards to finance. But what has been the experience for you in Lekela, and what determines, your decision to move in a given market, and how do you thrive in the different kinds of regulatory environments we see across the region?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the questions. Before I respond to those, just a quick summary about who we are. Lekela, somewhat different than other companies, we are only focusing on renewable power, and only in the African continent. We exist only 7 years, and we started with 0 megawatts, and now we are operating already over 1,000 megawatts in the African continent, which is quite a success, you may say. We are probably the largest pure play renewable player in Africa. But it's actually very small. Let me talk first a little bit about some market numbers so that you can see where we are actually with respect to renewable power. Currently, only about 6 or 7% of the energy mix in Africa is renewable. The majority is non-renewable, the vast majority of it, But when you look at the ambition of the governments, they want to be at 20 to 30% typically, some even beyond that number, within the next 5 to 10 years, let's say, until 2030. Now, I've just seen very recently some numbers, what it actually would mean, financially speaking, and what the outcome was if the governments want to achieve their targets, the greenhouse gas targets by 2030. The investment overall will need to be 10 times more. Not 3, not 4, 10 times. And I think if you've been in the financial field, you know that capital always goes the path of least resistance. That means there is a competition of capital, and that needs to be in the minds of the people when they want capital in. And by the way, just to another number, sorry, is not only it has to increase tenfold, but it cannot be done by governments alone. There has to be a close cooperation between government and then foreign financing, foreign equity, foreign debt. It's simply not doable otherwise, because also local financing is only partially available, very small pieces. So there is a hunt for capital, and if you want to achieve it, this is required. What does it actually mean? It means that certain frameworks have to be there. The first thing that the investor always looks at is stability, political stability. Are the people there, politically stable over the years, yes or no? Is there a law in systems which allowed us as a foreign investor to get our rights if there are some disputes? Is there a framework for getting money out again? All those type and many other questions, they need to be resolved. And so that's one area that needs to be done. The other thing is, of course, and I say this quite often, there are very good working examples in Africa. Look at the countries like South Africa, like Egypt now, which only in 7 years became from zero, to one of the top companies attracting capital for renewable power. Look at Morocco, and Senegal, other places. So they are good examples. And what I'm saying is copy with pride for all the other countries. These systems are there. They don't need to be reinvented, because the time is just simply not there for this. So if we really want to be there by 2030, if we want to achieve the SDG goals by World Bank, we need to step up. And that means all of us needs cooperation between everyone. And maybe, we'll talk obviously a lot about this, but, just to give you a hint, the company Lekela actually means working together. And that's what it's really needed in order to be successful within the next 7 or even more years in introducing more renewable power into the African continent.
Thank you very much. It's really quite impressive to know Lekela actually means working together, and actually it's typically in the African spirit to do build alliances within communities to make things work, moving together. I think that notion of partnerships is something that plays out really strongly from a governance perspective as a necessity that has to be in place for investments within the power sector to work well, especially when the sector has different different interventions from different stakeholders. One of those stakeholders, of course, is the state in most of these spaces. And from conversations we've had today, I think issues keep coming up about how different states, conduct themselves when it comes to attracting the kind of foreign capital that is essential to grow, the sectors. It would be interesting to hear your perspective, maybe Alex, coming back to you, on how the kind of stakeholder relationships should ideally play out, and what's been the practical experience for you across some of these geographies, and where the stitches need to be made to enhance the environment, such as to be able to receive more capex to match that ambition to what is reasonably achievable.
Yeah, I mean, that could take an hour to answer, but I think to my point earlier about integration and the change, if you like, I do think it depends how you look at it. The larger scale IPPs that we're used to doing, there's definitely a need for clear policy. There's definitely a need for welcoming renewables onto the system, whether that's for the renewables' sake or to allow the gas to be built, because that's a kind of prerequisite of doing a Paris-aligned gas project anyway. So that's a key item which is quite often missing certainly in some of the West African markets, just because there's plenty of gas. So why would you pretend otherwise? But then if you look to the sort of trend to smaller projects, direct access to customers, maybe even mini-grid or off-grid captive type plants, then you need less of that type of support, and what you actually need is a more relaxed regulatory environment to enable those projects to actually happen, and you can bypass some of those big problems like sovereign guarantees, even sovereign credit kind of ratings. That becomes less important if you're doing small projects with much closer ties to the customers themselves. But in many places that's blocked, so that would be a key enabler, I think.
Yeah, in some geographies, I know you're well, you've covered the West African, Central Africa sub-region quite extensively. And in some geographies, you have issues that emerge around maybe issues pertaining to liquidity as well, and issues pertaining to the ability to make new investments in those environments. Are there any cases you may want to speak to, and how you were able to navigate, and thrive, in some of those spaces?
In terms of dealing with liquidity issues.
Yeah, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm at danger of repeating myself a little bit. We're certainly our experience has been, large-scale projects and therefore traditional solutions, if you like. We're certainly looking now to be far more flexible, and then achieving that kind of those liquidity concerns or solving those liquidity concerns more by reference directly to customers. Possibly you can solve some currency type issues with local finance where possible, but not always. So yeah, just trying to be much more flexible and creative, I think, is the short answer. That those waiting for the big sovereign guarantee to come is not necessarily going to be the solution.
Absolutely important. Did you want to speak to some of that?
Maybe I can do so. Obviously, we have similar problems. We're working in the similar environment, and if we're honest about it, the big white elephant in this room is payment, getting paid. That's what it is. And unfortunately, the COVID situation and now the Ukrainian war has made things even more difficult than it used to be. So we have situations where, the private investors need to wait, and I'm talking for long waits to get paid. And of course, this type, when people hear about this, the appetite to invest is not there anymore. We have to face that risk. So I also hear a lot of times that, counterparties are saying, well, why are the privates, why do they need government support? Why do they need government guarantees? But the answer is relatively obvious. The answer is that our counterparties, which are the utilities, they do not have the financial power. That's as simple as that. If those are being restructured, so they do have, then these government guarantees would fall away. So if you really want to do the big projects like Globeleq or ourselves are doing, it's needed. Otherwise, you will not be able to attract neither equity nor debt for this project. So that needs to be I think, understood. And if you just try to go around this issue, you will not win at the end of the day. So it's important that this is being resolved very quickly.
Loic, yeah, I know you've been structuring financial components of deals, and do you want to speak to some of this?
Yes, I think the issue that both Chris and Alex mentioned are real, and I think that's where the government can step up over the long term. Because in reality, and maybe if you just take one step back, and what's happening, we need to look at the whole value chain. If you want to be able to attract investment, you need to plan for investment. So you need to be able to say, here's what I will do in 10 years on the generation. Here's what will be my transmission needs. Here's what will be my distribution need based on the objective where I want. As you do some of those plans, which are called master plan, they have various names in various geographies, you're giving a direction of travel so that generators know which project they need to develop, and you also need to know how you size your network. You also need to know how you would sell your operation, because a lot of the payment issues that we see in the continent are also not coming on the generation front, but they are coming more downstream. That's one of the reasons why Gridworks has been built, has been created, and why we're so bullish on some of the work that we need to do, because it is when the power is effectively consumed. So when it's reached the end user, that payment can be made and cash coming into the system. It's when those networks, both transmission and distribution, are run efficiently. That means that you're reducing the losses so that you ensure that the tariff is low so that customer can pay, and then that money will also flow to the whole stakeholder. So we don't necessarily be commenting on the current situation, but I think that's where the states have to play, the state and their agency, to be able to give a direction of travel so that they will be able to say, for my whole sector, I need 100 billion. Here's the part that the state will allocate to. Here's the part that we are asking private sector to come in those various plans. And once you've built that circle, there are certain countries, mainly sometime in East Africa, that have a track record for having IPPs. And when you build that track record of payment, because you have sectors that are run efficiently, the request for the guarantees and all of the structuring capital will come because people will be interested in investing into those geographies. So there's a bit of work to be done upfront by the various governments, and also being able to give that clarity. It will also help. That will be a virtuous circle which will help the economies, especially in West Africa.
Thank you very much. I do understand we're running quite short on time, but this could be the opportunity to turn it on to the audience for any questions or any comments that you may want to put in at this point. Do just indicate by show of the hand, and we'll get the microphone to you. Okay. Quite interesting. So we will just maybe get the opportunity for each panelist to do wrap-up comments. I know there was another angle which we're going to take about the energy mix in terms of generation, what other options there are. We spoke before about green hydrogen, wind energy, but this, in your wrap-up statements, if there's any element of that you want to capture, please feel free to do so. Maybe I'll start off again from Alex, then Loic, and then Chris for your final statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd just say it's a genuinely exciting time, both, I mean, not just for West Africa, across the world in terms of energy. And West Africa's got its own unique challenges, which you know, we're all here to solve, right? It's an exciting time. I think that's how I'd leave it.
I would say that we're bullish on energy. Generally, we're bullish on West Africa. We're bullish on Francophone Africa, because I think at Gridworks, we believe that energy can help deliver economic growth. If you have reliable, affordable power, then you can build on to have manufacturing, to develop industries, and I think it's quite instrumental to where we are. And we will encourage, if we have one message to stakeholders from the state, but even from industries, is have that planning, that direction of travel to help secure those investments and to help investors come in and support them, because it's a work which have to be in conjunction, be it in generation or being in transmission and distribution, as Gridworks does. And in a couple of years, maybe in about 10 years, we will get there. But some of the decisions to arrive at that point have to be taken now, and some of that planning and direction of travel need to be set now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and I would say actually that the golden age of renewables is still ahead of us, for various reasons. Number one is that the resources, the natural resources that Africa has, including Central and West Africa, are second to none. When you look at solar, wind, it's really fantastic, and other natural resources. But not only that, we think that particularly if you cooperate in the African environment, providing clean, affordable electrons is not everything. It's maybe half of the job. The other half of the job we didn't have enough time to talk about is community investment. So if you want to do good work and be there for the long term and be an integral part of the economic society of the community, you need to give more back to the community than just, clean electrons. And that's, I think, what we like to do, because it's also about, educating the people, providing them with good jobs, bringing in new technology to the country, etc. It's not only about providing electricity. And the beauty about the African continent is, maybe unlike the European continent, is because of the great resources natural resources that they have, they can produce green electrons, if you wish, on a very cheap basis, much cheaper than we can do here in Europe. And they can use it as an export. And here, where we were talking about, green hydrogen, green ammonia, as you all know, Europe is asking for it. Can get every ton that you can supply from Africa, they would take. So there's a huge opportunity, but it will not come for free. People have really to step up their efforts and do things like, for instance, certain countries are doing already. If you look at Egypt, for instance, is a great example how they're trying to use their natural resources to bring power to Europe and earn good money based on this. So I think Africa stands here to win. It's just for them to take now the pole position in that respect and move forward as quickly as they can.
Well, on that note, thank you very much. We've clearly outlined that there is lots of potential across different geographies and continents. We've recognized the fact that the UK has a lot to offer, both in terms of technology, but also in terms of finance. And we do recognize that we need to find ways of addressing all those systemic challenges that keep capital away, or that make it difficult to match the ambition to a realistic project rollout. With that, I would want to say thank you to all the panelists, very distinguished gentlemen, doing great work across Africa. And I do thank you as well for your patience this evening, and I would sign off from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great discussion. We'll have the next discussion on finance starting in 2 minutes.